Hello, everyone. Daniel Forouzan, host of the Schmoozing with Forouzan podcast. As always, I'm excited, and it's a special day because it's very rare we have repeat guests, at least so far in the tenure of this podcast. And the reason we have a repeat guest is because the last time he came on, he made an impression on me. And what was that impression? You know, when you interview people, you get to see various aspects of how they present, whether they're genuine, whether they seem reliable, whether they seem authentic in various things. And in the arena of discussions which begin to bleed into politics, I find it harder and harder to find people who I find reliable. But thankfully, Eric Siddall has come back onto our podcast for the second time. We're very, very happy to have him. And I'm looking forward to hear about what's happened, what's changed ever since we had him on last. So Eric, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for that very kind introduction. I appreciate it.
No, I mean, look, when we spoke last time, you were nuanced. You had sophistication in the points that you made. For example, we discussed the three strikes law. And correct me if I'm wrong, but generally speaking, the three strikes law, if applied mechanically, can be draconian. However, the prosecutors that are out there are aware of this. And ideally, you know, I guess it may depend prosecutor to prosecutor. Ideally, the prosecutors would take that into consideration and not apply it in a draconian fashion. Did I kind of get that correct based on our previous conversation?
Right. I think you have to look at each case on a case-by-case basis. You kind of have to look at the defendant. You have to look at the crime that they've committed. You have to look at their history, who they are, what types of crimes they've committed. Have they tried to make amends for their crimes? And then you also want to look at the time that's passed from the strike to the current case that we're talking about. So all those factors kind of have to blend in together, and you want to look at, you know, each case individually, and you want to use the tools that the legislature and the people of the state of California have given a prosecutor, but you also want to use those tools with a lot of discretion to make sure that the just result happens on each individual case.
Okay. And so before we jump into what's happened since we last spoke, because I think the three strikes are going to come up, let me ask you this question. It's a tough question. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it. Let's say three strikes were applied mechanically, and let's say we agree that that could be draconian in certain circumstances. How often would you say three strikes was applied mechanically? And how often would you say it was applied with more sophistication, as you just laid out in the factors you listed?
Well, so originally the way that three strikes was created was to give very little discretion. And so you had people going to prison in the 1990s when it was first applied, these famous cases where a person has stolen like a pair of jeans or a pizza, and they go to prison for the rest of their existence, or for, not their whole existence, but like 25 years to life. The equivalent of what we would charge, the sentence would be for someone who committed first-degree murder. And that system didn't really work. It created a lot of inequities in the system. There was a lot of pretty draconian sentences done in the 1990s. Then what happened was Los Angeles County, the DA's office there, kind of used a little more discretion and only charge three strikes if the crime was a serious or violent offense as the third strike. That became the actual law of the state of California. 12 years later, there was some reform that really happened. And that reform happened because you had a good test case in Los Angeles County, and you had 12 years of data to show that the three strikes law was actually the way that LA was making it happen was actually making our communities safer than other counties where the three strikes law was being applied in a very literal sense, in a very draconian sense. And so you had data now for 12 years, and LA County actually saw a increase in safety and a decrease in violence within the community because of the way three strikes was being applied. So I think that's an important fact to kind of consider, because three strikes law actually makes a lot of sense, but it only makes sense for certain types of offenders for certain types of offenses.
Okay. Okay. Thank you for breaking that down. Let's hop into what's happened since we last spoke, because I know three strikes is one of the things that, if I'm not mistaken, there's a recent case involving someone who didn't get the third strike, or explain that to us.
So there was been a few cases, and the most prominent case that happened was last June. Two El Monte police officers were murdered, and they were murdered by a man who should have been sentenced by the three strikes law. He was not sentenced by the three strikes law because of George Gascon's policies, and both officers who responded to a domestic violence incident were murdered by this man. And that kind of highlighted the absurdity of the other side, which is not to apply three strikes at all, not to look at this on a case-by-case basis, and just have a blanket policy that did not use the three strikes law.
Let me ask you a question. It might be a tough question. You might not be able to answer it. Let's say the three strikes law was applied to this individual, including the factors that you mentioned earlier. What would the outcome have been?
He would have been in prison at the time of the murder. In other words, he would not have been out on the streets and would never have had that opportunity to kill these officers. He would never have had the opportunity to be beating his girlfriend in a hotel.
Okay. And is there, the thing with law and policy is, what is it? There's no right decision. There's only trade-offs. I've heard that. I think there's a truth to that. Just to give the audience an example, I do employment law. I could speak on that. I can say that certain employment laws in California are very favorable to the employees. That's going to be at the detriment of the employer. Now, I agree, because there's a power differential that needs to be addressed there. So here we're looking at, okay, three strikes was initially a rather draconian sort of a thing. It got reformed, in particular in LA County, which is nice to hear. And it would have at least prevented, if applied in such a way, this one murder, or this actually double murder. But is there a flip side to this coin? Is there an aspect whereby the times that three strikes weren't applied actually created for a better circumstance?
I can't think of a case like that, because there's always discretion within three strikes to strike the strike. So if you know that the person has kind of changed and evolved, then you can apply your analysis on that case and strike the strike. Now, look, I'm not saying that certain prosecutors always use that kind of discretion. I think one of the faults that that's I think is instilled in prosecutors, and young prosecutors in particular, is that you never want to take a chance on a defendant. And I think that's wrong. I think we should be taking chances. We should be looking at people on an individual basis. And if that person has changed, if that person has evolved, if that person has shown that they could live in civil society, and yet somehow made a mistake that landed them back in front of the courts, then you want to use that discretion. You want to make sure that the just result happens. But you want to be able to have those tools to be able to deal with those all types of cases, whether it's the extreme case of the person who has truly changed and evolved, to the person who is the hardcore criminal who's committing acts of violence, who has shown that they have no regard for living in civil society. And I think that's why discretion is extremely important, is because you want that individual case analysis.
Okay, let me ask you another. I'd say this is a tough question. I'm sorry, it's all tough questions so far today. The reason I think this is kind of tough is it's almost theoretical. I keep asking you to stand in other people's shoes and answer. So if I was to say, if you were to stand in, a prosecutor who agrees with the perspectives of George Gascon, or in George Gascon's shoes himself, and we look at this example where the two officers were killed, what would you imagine? I know it's speculative to an extent, but I try to steel man things as much as I try to straw man them, and I think that's worthwhile. And what would you think that they would say about that?
I think they would say that the whole entire system is wrong, and that they're trying to create a system that basically corrects past injustices. I think that's what their goal is. The problem is they're taking it from the wrong angle, right? So, does there need to be reform? Yes. But where's that reform best served? The reform is best served in trying to reform sentencing laws that apply when people are in state prison, to give flexibility so that parole boards are able to get, to look at someone and make a determination whether that person has reformed. Where else can you do good reform, good positive reform? Again, I think a lot of that happens in the state prison system. You want to make sure that people are given programming so that they don't commit crimes when they get out, that they're given the resources to be able to live in society once they're released. So that's where the good reform is going to happen. You don't release people without a plan. You don't, in mental health, for example, this is another big issue. In mental health, you want to make sure that there is a plan of treatment, so that sometimes you put people in residential programs that are not lockdown facilities. And those are easier to create because you don't have to, create an entire infrastructure that involves using, guards, people that, forcing people to stay within those facilities. But there are other individuals, other defendants that require a lot of structure, and that structure includes a lockdown facility to make sure that they can't just leave the facility whenever they want to. And so you have to create this structure, this infrastructure, and that infrastructure allows you to reform. It allows you to give people chances, and it allows the defendant to be able to reform. It protects society, and it protects the victims.
Is there any discussion about those exact types of reforms currently floating? And if not, why not?
So actually, our state prison program, state prison system has actually implemented a lot of different reforms. Those reforms will only work when you re-examine sentencing laws, because you want to give people the incentive to go into those programs. And I'll tell you this, I think one of the problems that we had for a very long time is draconian sentences have meant that people who have gone into state prison have zero incentive to reform, because they know that even if they were to reform, they would remain in state prison. So you want to have those programs there. And I think the state prison system, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, doesn't get enough credit for the good work that they're doing. And the other thing is, you also want a governor who is willing to take the chance and commute people's sentences. We actually have, a lot of people like to poo-poo on Governor Newsom. Governor Newsom is actually taking some pretty courageous steps in commuting sentences at the ire of a lot of people on the far right. But I think it's important to do that because you want to use executive action, the governor's actions, to be able to give people hope, so that they know that if they actually do these programs, if they actually start to reform, that eventually they can leave prison, even if they have very long sentences, or in some cases, sentences involving life without the possibility of parole. So the important thing is you want to give the inmate an exit strategy. How do I leave? How do I leave state prison? And if you give them that hope and you give them the programming, I think you can actually see rehabilitation. If you don't give them that hope, there's no incentive to rehabilitate.
Let me ask you a question. Is the term, let me see if I get the term correct. When the governor waves a magic wand, is that called clemency? Is that the term?
So there's different forms, right? He can commute a sentence, he can grant a pardon, he can grant clemency. All of those things are geared for as a safety valve for the system.
Interesting.
To make sure that people who are, who should not remain in state prison actually have a path of exit. All of that is under the executive power of the governor. And then you have, so that's one set, right? But the other way that you can kind of reform sentencing laws is that you can go away from a strict determinate sentencing system. And this is a system that we developed in the mid 1970s. Mm. And what it does, what that system was trying to change was that there was a big criticism from two different groups. One was from the left, one was from the right. The left said parole boards are racist and therefore people are not getting equitable treatment. The other side said, well, certain people are getting out way too early. You've committed a murder, you served 5 years, that's not enough. So they created this hybrid system, which had some life sentences, but got rid of most life sentences and said, you only have to serve a set amount of time. That's called determinate sentencing law. The problem with that is that it doesn't take into account whether someone is dangerous or someone has reformed. And so you kind of want to rely on a parole board that is given a lot more information about what a person is like. And they make that determination about when someone remains a public safety risk and when someone is no longer a public safety risk.
Okay. So, I mean, we're effectively getting a lesson in civics here, which is good. I really doubt look, I'm a lawyer. I don't know any of this stuff. I'm obviously not a criminal lawyer, but
let me stop you there. Most criminal lawyers don't even think about this part because most criminal lawyers, their view of the case ends at the after litigation. What I think we need to think about as a society is how do we make a criminal justice system that is both just, protects the public, but also acknowledges the idea that someone can rehabilitate and gives that person the chance to rehabilitate. And that's more than just being a criminal lawyer. That's about thinking about what is the purpose of our justice system, what is the purpose of our prison system, and how do we reduce violence, keep people safe, but also make sure that people have an incentive to actually change.
Okay. I mean, there is so much to discuss here. And again, when I say the civics lesson thing, I think it's excellent. I never looked at the clemency and things like that as a safety release valve. I never looked at it as a fail-safe, a backstop, whatever terminology you want to use. And it's interesting when you look at it from that perspective. Geez, I wonder how much time the governor's office puts into that. I certainly would hope. I would hope a lot, because if there's people who deserve clemency or the people who have been wrongfully convicted or whatever it might be, I think most people would be pro that type of thing. So it seems nonetheless a lot is reverberating around policies that are trickling down from Gascón, and I want to make a point here. When I approach these conversations, I know I have Eric on, and I know I don't have George Gascón on. We would be happy to have him on. Would he come on to this particular podcast? I don't know. The thing about Eric is I see him on the nightly news, and then he comes on my podcast. He's, again, when I say reliable, he's not shy And I'm not just asking like Mickey Mouse questions. We're getting a bit granular here. So if someone like George Gascon or a prosecutor who's like-minded would want to come on this podcast, please, someone let me know. I'm happy to have them on. I'm happy to ask the same questions and try to approach it with as objective a lens as I can. Now, that being said, let's talk about what's going on in his office. So is it, I understand that there's a lawsuit in his office. Now, look, I know that you can file a lawsuit over literally anything.
Right.
And a lawsuit can be merited, it could be unmerited. It doesn't necessarily mean the lawsuit is related to the issues that we're seeing going on right now in Los Angeles. Would you say, can you explain to us what the lawsuit generally is about? And do you think it has any bearing on the issues we're discussing?
So there's actually a bunch of lawsuits going on in the DA's office. So some of the lawsuits are about retaliation, and that has to do with his management style.
Mm,
One of the problems with this current district attorney is that George Gascon is not a prosecutor, and there are certain ethical duties that a prosecutor has, and I don't think he's ever had to deal with that. You have to remember, where does he come from? He comes from the management of LAPD, right? And that management style back in the day, especially in the day of Gerald Gates, was one of command and control, right? You had your leaders, and if anyone below the leader fell out of line, you disciplined that person, and you disciplined them harshly, right? Because you want to make sure that people are forced to listen to you. A prosecutor's office is somewhat different because we shouldn't be structured as a paramilitary organization or a military organization where the commands and edicts of the top prosecutor should just be obeyed blindly. Our obligations are to enforce the laws of the state of California, make sure that we honor and respect and follow through with the mandates both in the federal constitution and the state constitution. So we have an ethical duty to do that, and we have an ethical duty to look at each case individually. I don't think he comes from that culture. He comes from a very different culture where people, are expected to follow the commands of their superior officers, and that works fine, I think, with law enforcement organizations. It works fine in the military, but public prosecutors always have a simple mission. And that mission is to always do justice, to make sure that the just result occurs in every situation. And that's just not the culture, the management culture he comes from. So as a result, there's been a bunch of retaliatory lawsuits where he has ordered people to do things that they feel are unethical. And rather than trying to kind of work within that system, he has simply retaliated against them. And unfortunately, we have a DA that has a long history of acting in a retaliatory fashion. I mean, his management mentality is extremely authoritarian. And that's why you have so many lawsuits right now.
And so in terms of, but okay, so he's authoritarian and there are retaliatory lawsuits. I guess we could say the authoritarianism could have some bearing on the discussion, but let's just focus in on the lawsuits for a moment. Maybe you don't know what the specific lawsuits are about. I don't blame you if you don't. Again, I'm asking a lot of detailed questions. But do you know if these lawsuits are, for example, if he told someone, take out the trash, the person decided not to take out the trash, he fires him. Okay, that's one thing.
Right.
If someone says, hey, Mr. Gascon, I can't do this. This is unethical. I can't make this decision. I don't feel right. And he goes, do it anyways. He does, and they fire him. It's a different kind of lawsuit. So do you know what the merits of the cases are?
So I'll give you one example that happened almost immediately after he became the district attorney. There was a case that happened in Compton, and it was a train derailment case. And he and his subordinate, one of his political cronies, went and ordered the head deputy of Compton Court to dismiss that case. That head deputy said, well, I need a legal justification. I can't just dismiss it because you think that it should be dismissed. What is the legal justification for it? The political crony said, never mind, I'll go down and handle the case. He goes down to Compton Court. He dismisses the case. By the way, the case was represented by a political contributor of George Gascón, who had the personal cell phone of George Gascón, and the defendant was part of a group that supported George Gascón's election to DA, okay? The next day, that same head deputy got an email from George Gascón saying, I understand that you refuse to follow my order. Well, that's not true. He didn't say, I refuse to follow your order. He said, I need to comply with the law. Tell me the reason why you want this dismissed. That is a form of, being an authoritarian. You don't get to just say, I'm the DA, I get to do whatever I want, dismiss the case. Before a DA dismisses a case, there must be a legal justification for dismissing a case. That's within our state constitution. That's within the penal code. In fact, the penal code says that a prosecutor shall not abandon a prosecution unless there is a legal reason to do so. So your orders must fall in the confines of the law. He can't just say, dismiss this case. That was lawsuit number 1, and it cost the taxpayer of Los Angeles County over $1 million just because of that lawsuit.
Jeez.
The other examples are subordinates were telling him, hey, your policy about 3 strikes, it violates the 3 strikes law. Those people were transferred because he didn't like the advice that he was being given. And so you don't have to accept the advice, but when someone is telling you something about the law, they shouldn't be reprimanded. They shouldn't be retaliated simply because they're telling you what the law is.
Is it so? Okay, so something, the majority of the audience is lawyers, so they already know what I'm going to say. But, if a lawyer says to you, I can't do X, Y, or Z because I need legal cause or just cause or good cause, it's usually a meaningful statement. That usually means there's a requisite and there's a requirement in the law.
Exactly.
To do exactly. Like those words are specific words of art where anyways. But okay, so that's a lot of, but before I say anything about the story, is this all an open, verified discovery? How do you know all that about that case? I know a second ago I said you might not know anything about the case. Now I'm saying, how do you know so much about the case? But is that open information?
Oh yeah, that's been reported on. It's open information. That's the case was settled. I'm not, speaking out of school. One of the things though that gives me a privilege or a lot of information in terms of the illegal activities that Mr. Gascón has done in terms of violation of employment laws because I'm the vice president of our union. So I have to deal with this on, all the time in terms of people feeling pressured, people feeling like they've been given illegal, unethical orders. And in fact, we actually eventually sued him on on some of his parts of his directives, the policies that he implemented on day 1. And we did it because we felt that our members were being asked to do something that was illegal and unethical. And we got an injunction. For the lawyers in that are listening, an injunction is a preliminary injunction is actually a pretty high bar. And it was pretty much unprecedented that a district attorney was told by a court, you're violating the law, your policies are violating the law, you need to stop that policy. That case there was a preliminary injunction. And the Court of Appeal eventually upheld the preliminary injunction, and now it's going before the California Supreme Court. The problem that we had was George Gascón said this law is unconstitutional and I'm not going to enforce it. Well, when there is prior precedent that says that the law is not unconstitutional, you as the executive don't get to just ignore what a court has said, what the legislature has said, and decide that it's unconstitutional. That's a violation of the separation of powers. That's the executive acting as the judiciary. That's the executive acting as the legislature. And again, that is not something that, talk about civics, right? I mean, this is basic civics, right? You have three branches of government. The legislature creates the laws within the limits of the Constitution. The executive has to enforce those laws, and the judiciary has to interpret those laws. We start to go into a very dangerous area when the executive decides, I'm going to ignore the legislature, I'm going to ignore the judiciary, and I'm going to decide that I'm all three branches of government in one.
Okay, if I, back to Daniel's theoretical questions, if I ask you to look into a crystal ball, and actually, I was going to ask you, what do you see happening in the next year to the district attorney's office? But there is an upcoming election, is there not?
Right. He's up for a re-election in 2024.
Let's talk about that. Let me just start generally. Let's go back to the crystal ball question. I know he has someone who's going up against him. We'll talk, and if you want to include him in the conversation, feel free. But just generally speaking, what's your opinions of what's going to happen with this election?
Well, I think there's a legitimate argument why he should not be reelected. And that's because of the incompetence of his administration. I think that's his violation of the law and his basic disregard for his duties, which is to protect the public and to protect victims. I think all of those reasons are why he should not be reelected.
But let me, and I appreciate that. And let's say that's let's grant all that. My question's a little different. It's more, what do you see happening? He's being challenged. Is it a viable thing? Do you think that the challenge stands a chance? I know that you and me have these conversations. I can't imagine every single person in Los Angeles is listening to my podcast. So they may or may not be informed about these things. Of course, George Gascón and people who are like-minded might have opposing views. Again, like I said, I'd love to have one of them on. That would be awesome, that I could actually bounce these things off them and see what they have to say in response. I think Eric really poses some challenges. I'd be curious to see what their responses would be. But
I would be curious too to see what the responses would be.
I do enjoy asking these questions. And Eric, I could do this with you all day. I think we should do this in person with an audience. I think
I would love that.
Absolutely. Like a town hall, right? People don't know this stuff. The civics lessons. I'm going to go out tonight. I'm going to be like educating everyone. Did you guys know that clemency is actually a pressure or a backstop or a release valve for the, So it's so interesting, and I'm so privileged to get to ask you these questions. And again, I appreciate you coming onto the podcast. That being said, instead of why he shouldn't be reelected, if we were to predict, if we were to say we're going to game theory this out, the challenger is this, he's that, he's entrenched here, he's weak there, this, that, I don't know. Are there polls? Are there not polls? What do you see actually happening in your crystal ball?
Well, I think he's failed to deliver on reform. So I'm not sure the base that he had back when he ran against Jackie Lacey is still there.
Interesting.
I think the reforms that he promised on day one are not really carrying out. And I think that he has kind of betrayed his base. I also think he has not done a very effective job in terms of implementing his reforms. So, it's a great thing to go in a campaign and talk about, all the wonderful things that you're going to, do in life. But if you can't actually implement what you argued for, then you really should not be reelected, because part of the job is to get things done. And he has not done anything of substance. I hear this from a lot of my friends on the defense bar. They don't feel like the office has really changed that much. And what he'll say is that, well, he'll blame saboteurs. No, as far as I know, no one is saying they're not going to actually follow his decisions, because he is the elected DA and he gets to make those decisions. The problem is he hasn't done a job in making sure that his decisions are properly carried out. He has no plan for people who are released. He has no plan on how to deal with violent criminals. He has a lot, the one thing about George Gascón is he's very good at the political game. He's very good at Twitter. He's very good at social media. He's very good at calling a press conference. Probably one of the most dangerous places in Los Angeles County is between a news camera and George Gascón. He's very good at that, but he's very bad at actually getting anything done. And anyone who has actually watched him in terms of his base should realize that the guy has been a complete failure in terms of making any substantive change in Los Angeles County.
What about his opposition?
There's a few deputy DAs who are running. There's a former attorney general candidate who's also running. I've heard that there's a judge who's going to run. So we'll see who ends up being, who puts their hat in the ring to unseat him. But I don't think LA County is willing to go backwards in time. I think that would be a mistake. I think those people who are running as, trying to restore a system that was broken, those people are not going to be able to unseat him. I think there has to be a vision about what the future actually looks like, and how do you balance those things that we were talking about earlier in terms of making sure defendants get a fair shake, making sure that those who are convicted get a fair shake, but balancing that out with the rights of victims and public safety and reducing violence within the community.
Do you remember there's a video of a guy, he plows into a woman and the child in the alleyway and drives off. The child is in a stroller. Fact check me, because I only casually recall this, but as I understood it, the individual who hit them got a fairly short sentence, or am I crazy? Do you know which one I'm talking about?
Yeah, that defendant he was a minor at the time. He was a juvenile. And I think, one of the things you have to understand about our juvenile system is very different from our criminal system. So within the juvenile system, the primary focus is on rehabilitating the juvenile. That is its primary focus, and that's really what the system is designed for. The problem with the system as it exists right now is that we don't have anything really to help and reform juveniles. We don't have a structure to do that. The infrastructure, in fact, has been dismantled. There was a state body that dealt with a lot of that. That was called the Division of Juvenile Justice. That was pretty much completely dismantled. It actually had a lot of programming. It had a lot of therapy. It was a safe environment because they had, prison guards there that were able to maintain order and maintain the safety of the juveniles that were housed there. That was all dismantled, and they threw it in back to the locals. I think it was more of a cost-saving measure, but at the long term, I think it actually cost the taxpayers more money, because we don't actually have a way of truly rehabilitating offenders who are under the age of 18.
Okay, so was that because you go on the internet and you see a bunch of people show that video and they'll say, "Oh, George Gascón." Well, that had nothing to do with his reforms.
No, I don't think it's fair to, and this is somewhat controversial on my part for saying this, but I don't think that actually had to do with his reforms. That has to do with the fact that the juvenile system is broken, and the juvenile system doesn't have a place to actually put people in so that they can reform. It also doesn't have a place to really keep people in the long term. Like there's no plan on where to house juveniles for more than a couple of months. They have these things called camps. Those camps are short-term facilities. They are not meant for housing juveniles in the long term. They don't have the programming, they don't have the finances. And the probation officers who work there are now being attacked. I've heard from many probation officers that they're being stabbed by juveniles, that they are being attacked by juveniles in a group. And the juveniles do this because they know that there's nothing that the system can do to them to be and basically the parole officers are completely left to their own devices. There's no programming. Sometimes they'll have a television where they can watch TV during the day, during the break, but that's about it. There's very little money and programming dedicated to those facilities. And so therefore, and also here's the other thing. How are you supposed to reform someone in 3 to 6 months or 9 months? That's not enough time to be able to get someone who's on the path of being a criminal and divert them from their criminal career to something else that's much more productive. So you're really not doing any service to the juvenile who is placed in those facilities, and you're not actually doing a service to the public. It actually works against both interests.
Interesting. Why don't, it could be so frustrating because here we are in a very wealthy city, in the most wealthy state, in the most wealthy country. It's 2023. We have the internet. Information travels very quickly. Why don't we have a better, so you presented all these issues with the juvenile system. These are now separate and distinct from the previous conversation we were having, which goes to show not only is there potentially an issue in the adult prosecutions and also in the juvenile situations as well. So why, let's focus on the juvenile here. Why would you say, granted everything you said, why would you say it is the thing that it is?
Our juvenile system of justice is probably one of the most important things that we can do to actually make real long-term, responsible, substantive change to our criminal justice system. Because if you're able to reform a juvenile at that age, you probably will prevent them from being a career criminal in our criminal justice system. But there is this attitude that you cannot, for lack of a better word, lock up juveniles. Well, you're not really locking them up. You're putting them in a secure facility so they're not a danger to the community, so they can't just escape back to their neighborhood. But you're also giving them long-term care that you're hoping will make them better, productive, nonviolent members of our community. And there's just not the investment in that. There's not the political will to actually implement that system. And there's this attitude that a juvenile should just be released back to the place where they came from. And then you hope and pray that somehow something will change within them. That's not enough. You can't just hope and pray that these problems away. You actually have to put in the infrastructure, give them the tools, give them the ability to make a change.
Okay. Is it now, all that being granted, is it that we're just not voting the right people in? Is it that the people who are in aren't doing the job? What's the plug?
I think there is this ideological, strain out there, and that ideological base has a lot of political power, even though they are, they're a small group of people, but they are the ones who are really active in California. And they push these ideas that, putting a juvenile in a lockdown facility for a long period of time is bad. not because they have any real data to support that, but because they ideologically think in their gut, right? They're using their gut and intuition to advocate for reform. Well, what your gut tells you is probably not always the right answer. Sometimes it is, but in this case, I think what we have is we have something that's ideologically driven, and people aren't thinking about what is good for the long term of the juvenile, and how do you integrate that juvenile back into society.
Okay. Look, I could do this all day long. I have so many questions. So when I have someone who I find reliable, my curiosity just like blooms. And again, Eric, thank you. Thank you for coming on. Thank you for taking the time to be here today. Again, this gentleman can be on television. He can be on, network news. He can be on things that have much more reach and are probably, with respect to them, and correct me if I'm wrong, easier interviews. When you sit down for an hour, which is what we've done here, it becomes tougher to just throw out a line when someone's asking follow-up questions and saying, hey, steel man this argument for me, which I literally did in this interview. So we appreciate your time. We'll definitely ask to have you back. I'm trying to.
Can I just follow up on that? I think,
please.
It's very easy to do give a few one-liners about this system. This is a very complicated system, and no one has all the answers to solve the problems of of our criminal justice system. But you really kind of get a sense of who someone is, what they really believe in when you actually have this conversation, when you engage in this one-on-one, extended interview, rather than just asking someone for a quick soundbite on the issue of the day. That's easy. Unfortunately, that's kind of how our criminal justice system debate goes. There's a horrific murder that happens, and then the public goes, wants some immediate action. And then there's something else on the other side that happens, and the public again wants an immediate, reaction. Our criminal justice system should not be governed that way. These are complicated issues. They require thought. They don't require one-liners. They do not require people to just give us their thoughts and prayers. They also don't, merit just these one-line draconian solutions either. Mm-hmm. So I think what you're doing is extremely important, because I think this is how we're going to actually make a better system, is by asking the tough questions, asking for details, asking for follow-up. And that's the real test about how we should be, really having this debate, not, 30-second lines or 15-second lines on any given news program.
Look, and I certainly appreciate you saying that. I 100% agree with that. It's really a compliment to you that not only do you see that, but you avail yourself to that. I would love to have someone on this show who is like-minded to George Gascón. I would love to have that conversation as well, if nothing else, just to edify myself and satiate my curiosities. Because again, having these conversations with you and seeing certain situations in the city, it really does make me wonder. I try to be as standoffish as I can with my own personal opinions, and frankly, I just don't have your education. I don't have your experience. You know this stuff, which is why we have you on. But I do have my reservations, let's just say, and I want the best for the city. I'm born and raised here. There's so much value to the city of Los Angeles, so much value to our civic here. And thankfully, we do have people like you who are willing to come on and have the conversation. And people are going to hear this, and people listen to this podcast. We actually get a pretty decent viewership in terms of the extent to which they listen. So they're going to hear everything you have to say. And I think I agree with you. It's nice to know that we're watering the soil with that type of information, and hopefully something blossoms from it. Like I said, we would love to have you on, whether it's through the West Side Bar Association, whether it's through my office or whatever it might be. Town hall, because I know right now I can come up with 50 people off the top of my head so easily that they would love to have a microphone and just ask you the same questions I'm asking you, and hear what you have to say. So I'll see what we can pull off for that. But For today, I've taken an hour of your time. That's tremendous. We appreciate it. I always like to let the person have the last word, but either way, Eric, thank you so much again for coming on.
No, well, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. And, I'm more than willing to do any type of town hall, anything like that. I think that these are important issues. And I think we have to have, we have to have an informed public on the criminal justice debate so that we do the right things and we don't go from one extreme to the other. People often say that, the criminal justice system is like watching a pendulum going from one side to the other. And there's a lot of damage that happens when it goes to the extremes.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Wonderful. Eric, thank you again for coming on. We'll be in touch.
Okay, thank you.